Yo, welcome to Grade A Fun. Yep, today is backgrounds with animation. Because I know a lot of times, and I do it myself, there's a lot of videos on doing character stuff, but there's very little videos on backgrounds. Like, wow. So, today I'm going to drop some background art, and like everything else, it always starts with a sketch, and the sketch is the most important part. I mean, you can sketch it digital if you want, but I like sketching on paper because I could do it wherever I am. Doesn't matter. You know, you could be outside watching TV. You could be anywhere. In the bathroom. I would recommend. Well, to each his own. So, I didn't sketch the entirety of where the window is, but I mean, I got the idea of where the window is. And so, the reasoning behind drawing all the stuff behind the dishes and everything is because there's animation that happens on top of it, and because it's not all contained in one layer, the stuff behind it has to be figured out too. If you wanted to take the time out, you could probably sketch the entirety of each layer that you're going to draw, but you know, artistically, you should, in theory, be able to make sense of the stuff hiding behind stuff. So, but it's always up to you in terms of how you want to work. So, it's always broken down in different layers of foreground, middle ground, background. Primarily because I want to play with some blurring of the deeper background things so that middle ground stuff sits on top of it a little bit clear. And also just so animation wise it's easier to control the different elements. So a little bit of a disclaimer, a little bit of a moment of honesty here. Initially when I was doing this, I didn't really think about the animation part of it. So you can see I went in here, I drew, you know, every single dish and, you know, cut the edges so that they overlap properly and, you know, did all the work for that. And after I thought about it, I said, oh man, it'd be cool to do some animation, just real simple animation for these dishes. And I was like, oh, I blew it though. I mean, I drew all the dishes without their extra parts and pieces. So if I did animate them, you would see the gaps. So this is one of those instances where you should have a clear plan. And if you have a clear plan, it means you do less redundant work, because redundant work is the enemy of animation or just work in general. You know what I mean? Like if you have to keep redoing stuff over and over again, it just sucks the life out of, because every time you have to redo it, you come into it with less energy and less enthusiasm. So right now I'm making just some color palettes for the different parts and pieces here, the elements, and the color. You know, if you watched any other videos, you know that the color palette system is one of my most favorite things on the planet, because it's reusable. So once I make it for this scene, I can reuse it for every other scene ever. So I just made up the colors that I thought I might want, based on just some magazines that I saw where they had you know, some color combinations, and I just kind of ran with that. And in general, it's basically a complementary scheme. There's a little bit of a violet and there's a little bit of a yellowish to the background so that they kind of work well together with each other. And then all the pots and pans, they're not completely gray or completely white. They all have a little bit of color to them, so they don't end up looking one note. You, as much as possible, want to try to avoid just using absolute black, absolute white, because they oftentimes end up either standing out too much or flattening things out. So if you need to, like, isolate them for, like, you know, the white for like the super highlight, the brightest highlight you need, and then the black for maybe line work, or I usually try to avoid the black for the line work. I try to add color to that as well, but you can use the black for like a super dark. Like you just need something that's uber dark, not like Uber drive you around, but like darkest of darkest of darkest of darkest of dark night dark. And then this is another. So I left some of these things in there so you can kind of see that sometimes in your process you do dumb redundant things. So I went in and I started doing shadow stuff, and it was kind of like a experimental play around moment, but not really. Like I was like, oh, I want to add some shadows to the background. That would be really cool. But then after I did it, I thought to myself, that's not quite how I want to approach that. And it was in a layered poorly, and all sorts of things were kind of amiss. So again, I left some of this stuff in there because a lot of times people don't show you that, oh man, I messed up, or there's a better way of doing that. And part of the goal of the channel really is, not just to go, hey, look, I got some really cool stuff, but it's to also to show you like, hey, the more conscious and aware you of or what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to do, the more effective and efficient you could be. So now here I'm going back in and I'm redrawing every single one of these dishes on a layer by themselves. There's really no reason to say that like that, other than it just felt good. And so there's no magic or mystery here. I probably could have tried to cut and paste them, but it would have probably taken more work to line up the lines properly from copying and pasting it from the previous layer, or erasing out bits. So I just decided to redraw them and then draw all the way through them and close them off where I thought they needed to be closed off. But I be honest though, this was really a time suck, and mentally it was aggravating because I knew that I wanted to animate them, but I just forgot because I got into the zone and I just started drawing stuff. And I was like, oh cool, I got all these layered, I cleaned all up the edges and everything, and then I was like, okay, so now let me set the pegs for it. It's all in one layer. So I actually, to be honest, I took a day. I think I took 2 days off because I was like, I got to redraw every single one of those dishes on the layers, and I got to put every single one of them on pegs. So I just took a break because it's not hard to do, really. They're simple drawings. It was just a frustration of like, man, I know better, and I should have been paying attention. So that's a life lesson, really, that sometimes even the best laid plans don't go the way you expect. Take a break, come back to it, and just knock it out. You know what I mean? Like, don't just forget it and be like, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. Right? You still got to press through and finish what you started. So I made a group, put all those in a group, and usually the way I use groups is just so I can organize things. So when I look at my timeline, I can collapse things, open things, find things quick. So it's not taking me, I'm not scrolling through, I have 12 dishes on the left, and then I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think there's 7 or 8 on the right. So that could be a really long timeline if it's not collapsed. And so if you group all your similar elements, it just means you have less things on a timeline. And there's no magic to that. It's just organizing and visually making it easier for you to be able to find the things that you need to find much faster. So again, this just drawing and going back in, breaking everything into a separate layers so that when I do animate it, that you can see through the things. And the drawing on this is not, I didn't draw every single pot originally individually, but you should be able to figure out how to put a bottom on a pot. And so the idea is later, if I decided to make the animation bigger or more broad, for this, I made it really simple. I just kind of made a simple bounce. The idea would be if it was somewhat interactive, a little kid could click it, the dishes would pop up and down, and it'd be kind of a, cutesy little thing. Nothing really tough or complicated or crazy where there's gigantic movement or anything. Later on, I might try to find some audio cues for it so I can make the timing maybe a little bit more specific to sound, which definitely makes it easier when you're animating things if you can animate them to sound. So now you can see both sides all layered out. I redrew it in blue because the original was drawn with the red, just so that it'd be easier to see the lines that I had below and now the lines that I have on top. So if you're wondering like why were they red and why are they now blue, it's strictly just because it made it easier to see. So after this, I did one more really dumb thing. I drew all of these new pots, pans, dishes on the color layer. Yeah. And I was like, oh my goodness. So I took another day off. And you might be thinking to yourself, geez, man, you just keep taking days off. Yeah, because once you get that frustration point, you're like, nothing good happens, right? So I took a day off. I came back, so all I did was I copied the line art from the color layer, pasted it on the line layer, went back to the color layer, made strokes for it, and then color filled it. And again, since I already had the palettes for it, the actual color fill took no amount of time. Like, that was actually really fast. But the reason I took a day off was just mentally, I was kind of aggravated with myself that, I know better. And it's simple things like not paying attention to the layers that you're working on can sometimes really mess up a lot of things, especially if you start doing different things with your nodes and you're trying to connect nodes to perform certain effects. Like, they just don't work because they don't work for certain layers, and you end up spending a lot of time frustrated, aggravated, being mad at the software when it's user error. And so paying attention, being alert, being aware, and if you hit a wall, not feeling like you can't just say take some time off and come back to it. So once I came back to it, I mean, to be honest, I think the coloring part of this was probably this is almost real time in terms of copying it from the color layer, pasting it on the line layer, and then filling it. I think it all took about maybe 8 to 10 minutes max, really, for both sides of these pots and pans. And then also you can see that the layering was really screwy, because when I drew it, I just drew it. You can see through the lines, so I didn't really pay attention to the layering. So for both sides, I just had to go back in and drag the layers around to reorder them so that they stacked properly, which again, that was part of the 8 to 10 minutes. So doing things that help you work more efficiently is really important. Do we blow it sometimes? Yeah. And it's not the end of the world. Not at all. I mean, unless you make it the end of the world and you're like, this is too much for me. So now this is the magic of the node view. And originally, to be honest, I was a little intimidated by the node view. Like, I looked at it and I was like, no, I'm not doing that. No. But once I learned the way it worked, that it's just, nodes that connect into other nodes, and it's basically like following a flow chart. Once you kind of look at it like it's just following a flow chart, it becomes super easy, and it becomes pretty easy to diagnose problems and issues that you have in your your shots or scenes or whatever you want to call them, right? Because then all you're just saying is, does this art properly connect to a composite that connects to a write or display node, right? Does this go from a peg, which controls all of this translation rotation, and does that peg connect to the art properly, and does that art properly connect to a composite, right? And that's usually the thinking process. And then in between there, like, you might connect some effects nodes, but in this case I just made pegs for all of them. And a shortcut, oh my goodness, is the best shortcut ever if you do node view stuff. If you select all your art, you do Control Shift P, it'll make pegs with the same name as the art that you selected. Oh my goodness. Like, instead of one by one doing Control P, Control P, Control P, you could do that, right? But man, like, that shortcut is the best shortcut ever, because you can see I think it's 12 pieces of art just for that one side. And if I had to do it as each one individually, it's time suck. It's boring too. So selecting them all, Control Shift P, boom. And then now I'm just selecting each peg and then moving the pivot using the advanced animation tools across the upper toolbar, moving them so that they're roughly where I think they might need to move from. Some I put at the bottom, some towards the middle. I was thinking about maybe doing some rotation on them, but I thought it might get too busy. I might go back later and do some rotation. I don't know. I'm not sure yet. I didn't plan out the animation in terms of like doing a whole bunch of thumbnails and stuff. This was really a more like, ooh, I could do some animation on this kind of thing. Because I a lot of times people just don't tend to do very much in terms of background animation, or even really discuss it much. So if I have more scenes that have background stuff and there's animation, I will definitely make another video, especially if it has more animation to it, because this is actually really simple. This is just far background, middle ground with all the pots in it that are going to animate, and then a foreground. And animation is really simple. It's just they translate up and down animation. So it's nothing difficult. It's not a mix of different techniques. It's just put everything on a peg and set keyframes for it so it goes up and down. So now what I'm doing now is I'm experimenting with how do I want to handle pushing this stuff that's deeper in the background further back. So what I did was I went into my effects and I put a Gaussian blur in there and dropped that on the layer that's the furthest back. And I also put a blur that's on that little faucet piece, because that's on a separate layer by itself as well. So I could push those two things back. And I changed my mind about what I wanted to do with the shadow for that stuff far in the background, and decided I'm going to redo that. And so what I did is I made just a complete layer that knocked back the value of the stuff behind the pots and pans as a whole. And I might decide later to do like a gradation on that, so it's not just a one note sort of fill. I'm not sure on that yet. I'm still thinking about what I'm gonna do with that. But the idea though is to just push and create more separation between stuff in the foreground and then stuff further back. And then it just adds that extra layer of flexibility. So if I decide I want it to be lighter or darker, all I really need to do is just go into that layer and adjust the opacity on it so that more of the color shows up and it makes it darker. I could have probably went into effects and did some sort of blending on it, but I think it works where it's just a color with some transparency on top of it. So I went in, I decided I'm going to remake the shadow, but mostly just make it for the roof and then some of the inside of the window parts. And I just wanted to make it relatively simple, not overly complicated. So I played with the opacity on it. I think I ended up leaving it at like 30-40%, something like that, just so that there's separation between the face of the wall and then the roof, so that it's not a one note, that you get a bit of dimension there. And then I added some value to the window and then the faucet as well, so that they weren't, even though they're flat, I wanted to add just a little bit of dimension to it. So, going in and putting those little bits in there was, just really helpful, just to add, a little extra. You might not even notice it, to be honest. Like somebody just, looking at it, they're probably not gonna say, "Oh, look at the depth on that." Unlikely that they're gonna say that, but it adds a little something. And the more visually astute somebody is, the more they might notice those little things and add that extra bit of visual interest. So hopefully some little kid might appreciate it. Maybe their parents might, I don't know. So I changed to a little textured brush because I didn't want the window to have the same sort of feel of the other parts, and most of that window is going to be hidden behind the pots anyway, so I didn't really need that much time and energy into it. So I went into the node view again to move where the roof was, so that I could have it sit behind all the pots and pans and everything. Because sometimes in the timeline, if your node gets broken and it's not connected anymore, it won't let you drag it from the top or bottom to where you want it in the timeline. So I don't even try in the timeline a lot of times to organize where I want things. I'll just go into the node view, mostly just because I feel really comfortable and it's fast, and I don't have to guess about is it working, is it not working, blah blah blah. So now the magic of animation, which, man, for this is like the fastest part, really. I mean, once you get all the drawings and stuff done, setting a key, moving in the timeline, setting a key, moving in the timeline, setting a key, scrubbing it and looking at it is really all you do. One little shortcut, and I didn't really, what I should have done though, now that I'm looking at this, usually for the art layers, I'll go into each art layer and I'll tell it, don't record animation information on the art layers. Mostly because if you ever do like drawing substitutions, and if you have keyframes on those art layers and you're doing drawing substitutions, if you decide to move your keyframes around because you want to play with the timing, you end up having to fight with your drawing substitutions, because sometimes they're in a different position on the timeline that you might end up accidentally overlapping if you're moving keyframes around. So I would say probably try to avoid setting keyframes on your art layers if you can. I mean, there's times where you might want to do some extra tweaking, squash and stretching, or something that might require you to put a keyframe on your art layers, but it's usually best to avoid it. I didn't even notice it until just now, which is bad. But when you're kind of blazing through and just you have a simple thing and you're like, oh, this is gonna be easy, that's when you make those kind of mistakes. But luckily this doesn't have any drawing substitutions or anything, so it's pretty easy. So you can see here, I just set some keyframes where it translated up and down, and then I just moved the keyframe so that it had a little bit of offset to it. The way that my default animation is set to do stop motion frames, which is why it looks really jerky in the beginning. And then I'll go back in and I'll do, set motion frames. So I'll just right click, select the keys and do set motion frame if I want it to be a bit smoother. In the beginning, I like it to be set stop motion frames so I can see if my specific poses are working. Because if the specific poses are working, you're good. If your poses don't work and it's smoothing through things and you go back and you're tweaking things over and over, sometimes it's harder to figure out what part of the animation isn't working. So, but there's no, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to animation, there's no set rule that it has to be done a very specific way. You know what I mean? Like, if you have a way that works for you, by all means, do what works. This is not, you have to do it like this because this is what animation is. Which I know sometimes, people get really, wrapped up in that this is the animation concepts. You have to do it like this. If you do things differently, if you have a different way of approaching your timing, if you have a different way of approaching your motion, knock yourself out. So the setting keyframes on this and then being able to tweak them, move them around. I mean, that's really the awesomeness, about this sort of approach to animation, where you have the flexibility of, if you don't like something, that you can always go back in and tweak it. You can always go back in and mess with it, move it around, adjust it, play with the timing. So now you can kind of see I've got a couple little offset sort of jumping pots here, which is, again, pretty cool. So that's the video, right? Like, it's not complex. Later I might do something that has perspective, vanishing points that are really complicated so you can cry, but that's it. Real simple ambient animation. Thank y'all for joining me. Subscribe, tell somebody else to subscribe, and I appreciate your support. Great. Fun.